The moral of today's story is that no matter how well you do your job, the politicians will screw it up for you in the end. Thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at Morphy's taking a look at a very rare, very cool Dutch Trials Luger pistol. Now, the Dutch were actually one of the very first countries to test the Luger. It was the Dutch and the Swiss initially. The Dutch had been starting to look around at self-loading pistols in the late 1890s. By 1900, they had actually done formal testing on 4 of the major players, the Roth, Bergmann, Borchardt, and Mauser. And then, kind of at the last moment, they end up getting a Borchardt-Luger pistol, which is the name that was first attached to what we now call just the Luger. Of course, the Luger is an adaptation or an improvement of Hugo Borchardt's C93 pistol. So, for a short time, it's called the Borchardt-Luger, then it becomes called the Parabellum. Anyway, the Dutch get one of these, or get 2 of them, and do some testing. And the guns work really well. They go through a pretty intensive process of endurance testing and rust testing and dunking them in water and covering them with sand. And the guns, they don't perform flawlessly. You know, these tests are severe enough that basically any pistol would have had some issues, but the Luger pulls through remarkably well. Well enough that the Dutch Ordnance Department says, well, you know, this is the best. We're going to toss all those other ones. We don't need Roth automatic pistols, and we don't like the C96 so much. We want to get 10 more of these Borchardt-Lugers and do some more serious testing. Now, this was going to be testing for the Dutch field artillery, and they were looking for a gun that would essentially work as a PDW, something to give the field artillery crews a way to defend themselves at reasonably long range without having to carry rifles. So the specific pattern they were looking for was a long-barreled gun with a detachable shoulder stock. And at this point, by the way, these are all in .765 Parabellum caliber. Now, DWM is busy doing some other stuff, and it takes them about 18 months to provide 10 guns to the Dutch for this trial. But they finally do come in October of 1901, and field trials go forward with them. They give half the guns each to 2 different regiments. And it's kind of inconclusive. Mechanically, everyone agrees that the guns are pretty good mechanically. But there's differences on opinions on whether they're practical. How practical is it to have this detachable shoulder stock for long-range fire? Are the men, the field artillery crews, going to actually have enough training to be able to make use of this gun and its capabilities? Or, you know, if they're poorly trained, they're not going to be able to hit anything at, say, 400 yards, even with a shoulder stock, and so why bother giving it to them in the first place? Ultimately, of the 2 regiments, one commander comes back very much in favor of the guns, and the other comes back very much against them. Leads to an inconclusive result. Move forward to 1903, the Army decides to do another trial. They are, by the way, this whole time, they're looking at these guns because they have an old revolver and they're short on revolvers and they need some new guns. And they're looking at, well, we don't really want to replace this with a bunch of 1870s old model revolvers. Let's get the new fancy stuff. So the infantry now does a test on the Luger. And now it's a sidearm, not a PDW, just a plain sidearm. So they have reduced the barrel length from 120 millimeter to just 100 millimeter, 4-inch, and no shoulder stocks anymore. We don't need those. Not an issue. And so they get a couple of guns in to try. Seems to work well. By the way, one of the funny elements of this trial is they decide that they want 10 guns, and they figure we'll do 4,000 rounds of ammo. 400 rounds per gun for testing. Okay, that sounds good. We'll need some magazines. And the guy in charge of the procurement says, well, okay, we need magazines. That's 4,000 rounds. The magazines hold 8 rounds each, so we will need 500 magazines with our 10 pistols, please. And fortunately, before they actually sent the contract over to DWM, one of his officers probably went, you know, sir, you can reload the magazines, so we don't actually have to have all of the ammunition preloaded in magazines. And the guy goes, oh, right, I of course knew that. Make that 75 magazines for our 10 guns. Anyway, skip forward to 1903, and the infantry is now ready to try out the Luger. The infantry is in need of some new handguns as well, and at this point, for the infantry, they're looking for just a plain sidearm, not a PDW. We don't need long range, just a sidearm. So they shorten the barrels that they want from 120 millimeter to just 100 millimeter barrels. That's 4-inch. They get rid of the requirement for a shoulder stock. So these guns won't even have a shoulder stock lug on them. And there's a slight delay. They decide they're going to test the Luger, but they also want maybe a lighter, smaller sidearm. So they also test the 1902 Mannlicher pistols. And there's like a 6-month delay while they decide maybe we should test the FN 1903s as well. Wait a couple months, go, nah, no, we won't. So just Lugers and Mannlichers. They get the guns in, 1904, do a bunch of testing, the Lugers win. Once again, the Lugers so far in this process never actually seem to fail a trial. They always come out very good. So the Lugers, the infantry's choice, now they need to do their own field trials, so they order another 174 guns this time from DWM. This is now late 1904. That order goes in December of 1904. And at this point, they're starting to hear about DWM has this new cartridge. They have a 9mm cartridge as well as a 7.65. And so the Dutch think to themselves, let's do this the smart way. Let's test both calibers, because maybe the gun works well in one but not the other. Or maybe we'll find something with one of the calibers that we do or don't like. So they order 109 pistols in 7.65 Parabellum and 65 pistols in 9mm Parabellum. And those take a few months to produce, not nearly as long as some of the early trials, but they eventually show up, and in 1905 the Dutch do significant field trials with these new guns. And this that we have here, to get back to the actual subject of today's video, this is actually a spare made by DWM for that 1905 shipment of Dutch trials guns. So let's take a quick look at it for a moment. The Dutch trials pretty much take place here at the boundary between the old model and the new model Lugers. So this example is in fact an old model style of Luger by basically every definition. So distinctively on the outside it has these scalloped toggles right here. The new pattern, the new model, would have these solid with checkering on the outside instead. This is chambered for 9mm Parabellum instead of 7.65. Obviously, as I said, the Dutch ordered both. There is a really cool marking on the bottom of the magazine. The magazine is actually, the wooden floor plate there is actually engraved with Cal 9mm. That's cool. That's something I had not actually seen anywhere before. Unfortunately, part of it is sheared off, but still, that's a really neat magazine. The magazine itself was nickeled, and the nickel is in, it's got some wear to it. As trials guns, these Dutch pistols are lacking most of the markings that we would normally expect to see. So this has nothing on the toggle and nothing on the chamber. And that's not just because it's a spare gun, that's how all of the Dutch trials guns actually were. We do have a serial number, so that's present there on the frame and on the barrel. The Dutch guns are basically in the 22,200 and 300 serial number range. If you get really deep into the weeds on Luger serial numbers, this is a complicated period in Luger production. Right in this same range, you have a bunch of German trials pistols. You also have the 50 American Powell Luger pistols, which are the guns that were supplied with the cartridge counter indicator grips. All that stuff is kind of mixed up within the same batch of numbers as the Dutch trials guns. Also, I should point out, there is no rhyme or reason to which of the Dutch guns by serial number were in 7.65 versus 9mm. They just appear to be randomly interspersed. The serial numbers on some of the other parts in either 2 or 3 digits, as is sort of the traditional, the typical norm for these. We've got it there on the takedown lever. Pull that off. We've got the last 2 digits there on the trigger. Then, as I mentioned, there is no shoulder stock lug because the Dutch infantry weren't interested in shoulder stocks. There is a grip safety on the gun, though. There is no marking on the actual safety lever, the manual safety. And other than that, it's pretty much a typical old model Luger. Now, one of the other interesting things that the Dutch did is when they placed this order, they said, by the way, 10 of the 9mm guns, we want to have a bunch of specific requests. We want you to basically create a Dutch model of gun. And it will have things like the safety marked in Dutch, rust for safe, R-U-S-T, and an arrow up here. and a few other various changes, and the most significant change was the Dutch wanted a better mainspring. So the old Model Luger has a flat S-shaped mainspring under there. I probably should have taken the other side off because it's hidden under the grip safety. So the old Model Luger has the old style of S-shaped mainspring, and the Dutch weren't really happy with that. So the Dutch actually, on their own, the Dutch small arms arsenal came up with a redesign that would use a coil spring instead. And they sent the design to Germany, to DWM, and they said, we want you to use this idea on 10 of our guns. And the DWM would end up actually adopting that as one of the primary modifications to the Luger that would transform it from the old model to the new model. Now, this is obviously not one of those 10 specific guns, but the vast bulk of the 65 9mm Dutch Trials Lugers, 55 of them had this style of original S-shaped mainspring. So I think it's really interesting that the Dutch were responsible for that improvement, perhaps the most significant improvement in the Luger pistol from its very first day. You know, once you get past like 1899, that's the biggest thing that's left to fix. There are other changes that were made. The combination cartridge, well, the loaded chamber indicators that were up there that were added on the new model, and a few other minor bits, but the important thing was the mainspring. Really, the only difference between this as a spares gun, this is by the way a practice that DWM had kind of in general, was when they did a military contract, they'd make a couple extras just to cover whatever, something gets damaged in transit or any number of things. Really, the only difference between this and the official trials pistols is the presence of a crown over D proof mark, which would have been here on the side of the barrel extension. These spare guns don't have it. But the actual trials pistols had all of these other blanks on them as well. To cover the last couple of markings here, the safety is actually not specifically marked. That would come later. But the loaded chamber indicator is marked carregada. All right, back to our Dutch field trials. 1905, the trials go really well once again. The only question really is which caliber do we want? And they come to the conclusion that the 9mm seems to be better. They've heard from, some of the countries, like the Germans went with the 9mm because they've had better terminal effectiveness with it in places like German West Africa and China. So the Dutch go, yeah, that makes sense. We will take the 9mm. The Dutch War Minister clearly requires no real convincing. He's on board because he doesn't even wait for the final report. He gets a preliminary report on these field trials and goes ahead and formally adopts the gun for the Dutch Army, writes up an order for DWM. The Dutch are going to need 3,800 new guns. The budget that they have for 1905 it will allow them to get like 917 guns, plus ammo and holsters and mags and all that stuff. So the War Minister writes up an order for 917 guns, but before it can be actually sent to DWM and fulfilled, the Dutch Parliament gets involved. This is ultimately their money that's being paid out. And there are some naysayers who start testifying before the Dutch Parliament, and questions arise, like, we've got rapid-firing cannons, and we've got machine guns, or we're going to have machine guns. Do we really need automatic pistols? This seems excessive, perhaps. And someone else points out, this is, I kid you not, did you see the penetration testing on that Luger cartridge? Like, that's got a lot of penetration. I bet if you got into a hand-to-hand fight with a Luger pistol and you shot the bad guy, the bullet would probably go right through the bad guy and hit one of our guys on the other side. Like, that's really dangerous. So we're canceling the order. The Dutch Army will not be buying any Lugers. That's all. Carry on. This really took the Dutch Army by surprise. They had been short on guns 6 years ago when they started this whole process. Yeah, the initial trials were for the artillery, but the infantry needed them too. The whole army infrastructure was seriously short on handguns. And they're now totally left in the lurch. They had no expectation that this kind of reversal would happen. So they go back to the manufacturers of their original old model revolvers to try and buy some of those. Like, well, I guess all we've got left, or let's get more of those revolvers. Well, no one who had made those guns for them was interested in making more of them at this point, not a small run like that for a gun that was clearly obsolete. And this left the Dutch really in a bit of a pickle. And what ended up happening was the Dutch army arsenal, a small arms arsenal, had to tool up and manufacture guns themselves. And that would be the Dutch new model revolver, which is why the Dutch adopted, if you look at the data, it would appear that the Dutch adopted a new model, brand new revolver in 1906, which seems rather late to be adopting that style of technology, especially a very old-fashioned revolver like the Dutch, not so appropriately named, new model. Now, this wouldn't really be the end of the Luger for the Dutch military. The Dutch colonial army, the KNIL, would end up adopting the Luger formally in 1910 as the model 1911, and that decision was not overturned by Parliament. So the Dutch did start getting a bunch of Lugers, but for the army, it would be a long time before they had an actual standardized semi-automatic pistol. Thank you, politicians. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I think it's a really interesting story behind the trials and the adoption, or lack of adoption. I guess it was formally adopted, they just then weren't able to actually buy any, of the Luger pistol by the Dutch, and the Dutch involvement in the actual improvement and development of the Luger pistol as well, which I think is a very, not really a widely recognized element of the Luger's design history. So this one may be an extra associated with the trial instead of an actual gun that went through trials, but frankly it's probably in much better condition for having not gone through those trials. Anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.